Where you stay, I'll stay. When you move, I'll move. I will follow.
I don't know about y'all, but growing up, one of the biggest, I guess, one of the manliest movies of my time was, of course, would have to feature Mel Gibson, because he was one of the manly men that we knew. And he starred in and directed in this movie that really stirred the hearts of men around. Do you know what movie I'm talking about? That's right, I heard it. Braveheart. What a great movie. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a really amazing movie. It's about, the story is based on a man named Sir William Wallace. He was a Scottish man during the time where they were essentially fighting England. The Scots were fighting England for freedom. So any movie where there's a battle against the English for freedom, us as Americans, it resounds in our heart, right? So you watch this movie and you're like, yes, right? Freedom. And I love how he does. And so you see all these epic scenes where he's like going around and he's just like killing people, right? Because that's what you do when you fight, right? In this war. And so you see him going around and it's just so motivating, I guess. I'm not really sure what you're motivated about, but you're just like inspired. You're just like inspired to be a man. So growing up, watching that, I felt like you watch this, you see the passion of this man or this actor, it just like bleeds through the screen. And you're just like, wow, this is so awesome. Right? And at the very end of the movie, he like cries out freedom, and everyone's like, yeah, this is amazing, right? And then we go back home and do whatever. But it's like, it makes us feel really good inside. But this legend of William Wallace, this is actually based on a real man. And he's a big deal in Scotland, not just in the movies. He was an inspiration, a martyr for his country. He fought for freedom, and his courage and his passion and his fight was contagious. It was contagious. Even till this day, they have this huge statue of William Wallace. Right? They see and they remember his not only his passion but his drive. It stirs something up within the soldiers that followed him and ultimately a country. Or I guess they're not really a country, but they almost got there, close enough. But it stirs something up within a people. The Scottish people. And so we have been going through Joshua. And we're going through this series called Strong and Courageous, where God's people live out courageous faith for his purpose, for God's purpose, and for God's promises. And so as we are in here this morning, and we're going to jump around a bit. If you are right now you look on the screen going, it's Joshua 15, verse 1 through 63. That is absolutely correct. There's 63 verses in this chapter. There's a lot. So we're not really going to cover a lot of those verses. But what I want us to see, and we're going to kind of narrow in on a few verses this morning. And what I want us to see is that wholehearted faith and active obedience is contagious. It is absolutely contagious. But when we settle for anything else, it can really set us up for failure. And that's kind of like the opposite. Without wholehearted faith and active obedience, it really just sets us up for failure. And so before we begin, I kind of want us to at least give a brief overview of what's going on in chapter 15. Because we're not really going to cover chapter 15, but I want us to at least kind of get us a good idea of what's happening. So if you remember from last week, Pastor Josh started talking about how they started drawing lots for the land. And they actually they crossed into the promised land. And so we already saw that the 2.5 tribes that settled east of the Jordan River, they got their land, but now this is like what this land is what God had originally intended for them. Right? This is the promised land. And so what they started doing is they started drawing lots. So it was like in their mind, it's not random, but the people aren't choosing. They're letting God choose. And so we see the first tribe that comes up is the tribe of Judah. Now, Judah is a man, he wasn't, the tribe of Judah, their forefather, Judah, he wasn't like the oldest. So it wasn't like because they came from the tribe of the eldest brother, they went first. He wasn't the oldest. And they had, but God decided to use them and choose them to do great things. So just like really quick, King David came from the tribe of Judah. And also Jesus finds his lineage to the tribe of Judah. So there's actually great significance, and we're not really we're not going to go into it, but we're seeing that God is not by chance. God did this on purpose. And what we also don't get as we continue to read this, and you're looking through this, and you're reading stuff like the boundaries of their land and the cities of their land, and for us it seems really like, what's going on, right? Like, I sit here, like if you went home and read chapter 15 on your own without really like thinking, it's not exactly like something where you can go home and be like, yes, right? I'm going to really bury and hide chapter 15 verse 10 into my heart, right? Like, and the boundary circles west of Baal, Mount Seir, passes along the northern shoulder. And it's like, yes, that I'm going to remember that, right? Like, you don't go around going, yes. It's like, we like to quote a lot of verses, but you're not going to really just quote these verses. It's like, hey, remember in chapter 15, verse 3, and they go southward, right? Like, we don't talk about these things. So what's going on? So instead of reading all this stuff, because if I sit there and read it, I would even zone out. Let's at least kind of get a picture of what they're saying, right? Might be a little easier, and then we can move on. So the next slide, we have a picture. I really hope. All right, good. All right, so essentially, what God has written here, like what God has given us here in this chapter, is the boundaries of Judah. So you see Judah is down here. I really wish I had those laser pointers, right? So this is Judah. In the middle is Simeon. And so it goes from all the way south down here, all the way north to almost Jerusalem. Jerusalem's actually in the tribe of Benjamin. They're right underneath. And so what's going on in this passage is he's just describing, this is the land I've given to you. But what's significant about this passage, or I would say this and the subsequent passages, is that the promise is fulfilled. And that's kind of what I want us to keep in the back of our mind. Remember, we've been talking about the promised land for a long, long time. And now he's getting to detail, like, this is your promised land. So he's going through this. But in the middle of this passage, he tells a story. And the story that we are going to pick up in verse 13. So I'm going to kind of rewind a little bit and remind us, what is the point of this message this morning? What are we trying to get at? What is our landing point? That wholehearted faith and active obedience are contagious, but settling for anything else can set you up for failure. All right, so let's hop over to verse 13, and I'm going to read for us, starting from verse 13. It says, according to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the people of Judah. Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. And Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Seshai, Ahamnan, and Tamai, the descendants of Anak. And he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir was formerly was Kiriath Sepher. And we'll stop right there. And we kind of say, what's going on? It kind of just like jumps into this weird thing, right? But the first thing I want us to see this morning is that when we wholly follow God, when there's this holy following of God, when we with this wholehearted faith, there's a response to that faith. There's a response to that faith, which is obedience. So if you remember from last week, we brought this story of Caleb up. And Caleb started in the story started in chapter 14, verse 6, where Caleb came and asked Joshua for the inheritance that God promised him and his family. So why does he have this promise of inheritance? Well, what happened early before that we kind of covered, and we won't go into detail, is that way back when, about 40 plus years ago, Caleb, Joshua, and 10 other spies went out to spy this land originally. And when they came back, they were the only 2 spies out of the 12 spies that said that they should go take the land. Not because they felt like they were strong, not because they felt like their enemy was weak, not because they felt like they had a tactical advantage, but they came back essentially going, I'm just reminded that God promised us victory, that God promised us this land. So essentially they could have gone and saw anything and anyone, and they would have come back with the same message. We can do it because God is on our side. But the other 10 were only able to see the giants, these giant fighters, and they got scared. Hence the wandering. Right? So 10 of them said no. The rest of Israel agreed with the 10 spies. And God goes, you're going to wander around for 40 years because of this. Only Jacob and Caleb will be able to enter the promised land because they were faithful, because they trusted me. They had faith in my promises. And so the story starts in chapter 14, verse 6, where Caleb goes, all right, we're ready to enter the promised land. And it's probably a great time, right, where Joshua is reminded, and they're both reminded about back then when we had this great time, this great moment together where we saw and remember God's promises. God has brought us through this 40 years, and we're finally entering there. And so Joshua gives him this piece of land, where we know is Kiriath Arba, which is now called, or which they call Hebron. And so we kind of end there, where 3 times in chapter 14, we see Caleb being called that he wholly follows the Lord. It's like that his heart, he wholly follows God. And so it ends there in chapter 14. He's given this land, and we're reminded about his faith, that he wholly follows the Lord. And then now we come back in chapter 15, in verse 13. And the story continues. This man, he's like 85 years old. And he goes and he fights. So he doesn't just have the faith, but now we see his faith in action. He goes and takes the land. He goes and brings his army and he leads them in taking the land. He's pretty, and this man we see, he's pretty pumped up for an 85-year-old man, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know a lot of 85-year-olds, but if an 85-year-old man came charging at me, I wouldn't be too worried, you know what I'm saying? Like, I just kind of like, what are you doing? But this got Grandpa Caleb ready to take his land. And we see him just moving forward in that. This absolute confidence. And he just goes and he drives them out. He drives them out. And we see that Caleb's faith talked about in chapter 14. The response is in chapter 15. So in Footprints, we've been talking and studying a lot in the book of James. And James, our theme this semester is called, the series this semester is called Real Faith. And it's a Bible study in James. And so we've been learning about what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean? Is it just believing in something? Is it just kind of like adhering to a bunch of creeds? Is it just having the correct thoughts or beliefs or theology? Like, what does it mean for us to have faith? I think a lot of us might think about that as well and wonder. And the conclusion in James, and the argument in James, is that faith must be paired up with works. That works, which is just doing good and right things, being obedient to God, is paired up with faith. And we see this in Caleb. Caleb's faith is put into action. Caleb is an example that we can look at as what does it mean for us to wholly follow God. Now, if a lot of you probably know that I am a big sports fan, And so as a guy, when I first moved here, I started listening to a radio station. So there's two things I really, I guess I would say that I like. It's country music and sports. And so when I first moved here, the first thing I found was the country music station. 95.7, or it was like Wolf 95.7, right? And slowly, as I started listening to Wolf 95.7, one day it changed on me. It became 95.7 the game. And I go, what happened to my music? And it ended up being a sports station. So I go, I like sports too, so I started listening to that as well. And so right now on the drive home, there's this one of the sports personalities. Every time he signs off, he says this. He goes, remember, sports do not build character, it reveals it. It's like, oh, right? And that was probably one of the first times I heard it. And it was probably, and I know, the great John Wooden has quoted this before, and various other people. He goes, sports do not build character, it reveals it. Started making me think a little bit about this. I'm like, how interesting. Sometimes there's a lot of truth in that. And as I took that and we applied this to where we are right now, works or obedience, they do not build faith. It merely reveals it. It merely reveals it. And this seems so simple. Right here in chapter 15, verse 13, Caleb, this man with this passionate faith to go take the land that God has promised him. And he just goes in this active obedience. Now, a question I want us to think about this morning is that where do we place our faith? This idea of strong and courageous is not Caleb being strong and courageous in himself. Right? When we talk about being courageous, we think like we just need to kind of like pull up our bootstraps and just go hard without thinking or worrying about the consequences. Right? That's a lot of times what we think about courageous. Like, be courageous, man. Right? Don't worry about the consequences. Go out and fight. But for this, Caleb is not going, be courageous and just go. He says, be courageous in God. It's courageous faith, not courageous action. Because he has this faith to trust. The action merely, it just follows. And so if works do not build faith, but works actually reveals faith, I want us to think about what our works reveals. Where do we place our faith? Because I think this is really important for us to stop and think about this. Do we have this wholehearted faith that Scripture constantly talks about? Do we have courageous faith? Do we have this courageous faith? And it's easy to find because we can just trace backwards by our works. How do we spend our time? How do we spend our money? How do we treat other people? How do we see ourselves or see others? Where do we place our priorities in? Those things will reveal a lot about where we place our faith. Some of us place our faith in hard work and education. That's what saves us. Or maybe status and family. That's what brings me worth. Or maybe it's our reputation or how people see us. That's where I place my faith. Maybe it's your car or house, safety and convenience, comfort and leisure. See, those works, the works that we talked about earlier, reveals where we build our faith in. Do we wholly follow God as a people? But I want us to continue there. I don't want us to stop there. I want us to continue in verse 7. In verse 15. I'll read. In verse 16, and it says, "And Caleb says, Whoever strikes Kirioth Sephir and captures it, to him I will give Aksha, my daughter, as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured him, and he gave Aksha, his daughter, as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she got off her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of Negeb, give me also springs of water." And he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. So, the second point I want us to see this morning, where wholehearted faith and active obedience are contagious, we see the contagious part of this faith, of wholehearted, wholly following God. That we see that the examples of our faith will impact the next generation. I want us to hear. The examples of our faith will impact the next generation. The examples of our faith will impact the next generation. Who in the world is Othniel? He is the nephew of Caleb. So Caleb goes, I can't take all of this, right? He's driving people out. He goes, hey, there's this other land. Whoever takes it gets my daughter as wife. For us, we might think that's kind of weird. That's okay, because the culture at the time was a little bit different. That was fine back then, right? And so for him, Othniel sees his uncle Caleb with this, he sees his uncle Caleb fight and go after he has this courageous faith. He sees Uncle Caleb and he goes, I can take that and appropriate that to myself. He looks at his own uncle and he goes, I can do that too. I can have that faith. I see that. I see what that faith became for him. He goes, I can do that too. And he does it. And do you know what happens later on with this man? In Judges, the book right after this, he's one of the judges. Did you know that? He was one of the judges that God raised up when his time was out. When everyone was gone, when the people of Israel started straying away, he raised Othniel up to be a judge, to fight once again, to drive the people out of the land, and he became the judge of Israel for the rest of his life. How did he get there? He saw Uncle Caleb. He saw what Uncle Caleb did. And this legacy of Caleb and his courageous faith that led to this obedience encouraged him, gave him a tangible example of this is what it looks like to follow God, and I can do it too. So in my time growing up, I had the great pleasure of watching Michael Jordan play. And when you're young, like me, when I was 7th grade, 6th grade, you don't really know what you're witnessing. Because that's the only basketball I know, right? I guess basketball is always like this. I guess the best player should always be like this. You don't really understand and see what greatness you're really marveling at that time. You don't get it as a 12-year-old. You're just like, this guy's awesome, right? But as I look back now, and for a lot of us know, Michael Jordan impacted a whole generation. He changed the face of all sports. He did. Now, anytime anybody dons the number 23, people know and wonder why, right? It's a sacred number. If you're going to wear 23, you better be darn good, right? They even had songs about him. I grew up singing as I played basketball, right? Like Mike, if I could be like Mike, wanna be like Mike. Right? We sang songs about him. We wanted to be Michael Jordan. I grew up, I didn't even take a normal jump shot. I would just try to fade away every shot I had because that's what Michael did. I would go up and switch hands because I was not a very good basketball player, but I tried. I watched him play. I go, I want to emulate him, right? For the longest time, the only thing I wanted to do was reverse layups. And I didn't want to just do a reverse layup. I had to go up and under just like Michael, right? Because that's what Michael does. Every time I went, everywhere I went, like, when you go underneath the door panels, like, like the door frames, as a kid, I'll go up and jump and pretend I was dunking. Pretend I was Michael. I'll go do all these things. But here's the thing, I wasn't the only one. A lot of us wanted to. Now, a lot of us didn't do anything with that, but some of them became actually really good basketball players. And actually that handprint of Michael Jordan was passed on to the next generation of ball players. I remember when Kobe Bryant came to the scene. I started watching him play. I go, this guy's like a carbon copy of Michael Jordan. He likes to shoot fadeaways. He's about the same height as him. The way he dunked and the way he just played, his game was so smooth. And then not that long ago, Kobe had an interview, and they asked him, like, did you try to pattern your game after Michael? And he's like, yeah, I try to take things from him and a lot of different players. Of course, Kobe, just like Michael, extremely arrogant and confident, would not admit that he stole all his moves from Michael, but I'm like, he did say, like, yeah, of course, I watched him and a lot of other players. And he goes, but if you watch this new generation of players, LeBron, Kevin Durant, he goes, I see some of their footwork, and I see me in there. I see some of this, I see me in there. And I'm telling you, it's not going to stop. Michael said that he grew up watching a man named David Thompson play basketball. And I don't even know who it was. I went and I looked him up, and I watched the highlights, and I go, this guy is amazing. But he watched him, took stuff from him and appropriated it to himself, made it his own. Kobe watched him. And all these kids, and then, here we go. We're going to keep on going, and they're going to talk about the players of the past and how they watched them and took moves here, did things there. We watch Raja Rondo. This guy is a 6-foot-something point guard doing the dream shake, okay? And if you don't know what the dream shake is, it's Hakeem Olajuwon's signature move, and he's a 7-foot center, and they're doing the same moves. This is my point. People are watching. They watched their heroes, and they took things from their heroes. And so I can do that too. Othniel watched Caleb, his uncle, be strong and courageous. And he goes, I can do that too. You see, people are watching. People are watching us. I've watched people. And there's people that have impacted your lives. Now, the fact that any of us are sitting here is due to somebody that impacted your faith or faith journey. You didn't come here by chance. It was either your parent or a friend or an aunt or an uncle or a brother or a sister. Somebody was your Caleb. So I want us to ask and think about this morning. Who is that Caleb in your life? Who's that Caleb in your life? Who's the guy that or gal that you looked up to? An example of your faith. And here's what I want you to do. Reach out to that person this week. Let him know. Because encourage that person. Encourage them to go, you have impacted my faith journey. I think about a couple years ago, I went and found my 8th grade discipleship leader. He doesn't even have Facebook, but his wife did, so it was easy. And it just one day, I just thought about it, and I messaged her and go, can you pass on a message to me? Can you let Ed know that what he did for me and what he'd done, spending that time with me in 8th grade, Sunday morning before church, meant a lot to me. It changed me. It helped me with my walk. Let him know right now I'm serving in ministry in California, and he made a huge impact on my life. I don't know how he took it. She told me, thank you very much. He's very encouraged. But can you imagine? I can't imagine if some guy, 10, 15 years from now, that I haven't kept up, Remember in 7th and 8th grade you did that? Thanks. That's really encouraging. So I want us to do that. Because as a people of God, we should encourage one another. And remember the people God used to bring us here. But I also want us to think and think about who's the Othniel in your life? Who's the person looking up to you? Who's the one watching you as their faith example? That they look to you and go, I want to have that person's faith. I can be strong and courageous like that person. Who gives you that example? And I want to flip over to this chapter, verse 63. This chapter ends really sad. Because verse 13 to verse 19 was really, it was pretty encouraging, right? It was a pretty encouraging passage. But it ends really sad. It says this, but the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwelled with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. We start this story in this chapter with Caleb's wholehearted obedience, wholehearted faith, and active obedience, the great victories that he has achieved, and then we finish this chapter with the failure of Judah. I was like, what the heck happened? Right? Like, come on. What happened here? Because I know that God promised, God promised in like chapter 13 that I will drive them out in your midst. You just need to follow and obey me. Right? You just need to have the faith that I can do it and actually do it. And I read this, I go, it seems like the people of Judah did it, right? Right? Who here goes, I read this and go, what happened? Because it said the people of Judah could not drive them out. Sounds like they tried. Who here goes, what's up with that? Oh, okay, I'm just me. No, we're done. Okay, well, let's just pray. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so I know a lot of you are probably thinking, like, what happened, right? God said God promised to drive them out, and then it seemed like they did it. Why didn't they do it? Now, Scripture doesn't say a lot. So we can't really speak too much about what it is. But this is what we do know. God promises that if you fully and wholeheartedly obey him, or like have faith in him, have trust in him, and obey him, he will carry it through. And we see that in Caleb. So what's the difference between Caleb, Othniel, and the rest of the people of Judah? What do you think the difference is? Because it looks like obedience, but something's missing. And this is kind of how I was able to see it as. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think the people of Judah started seeing themselves more as mercenaries of God rather than people of God. They just started doing what God told them to do without really having that, without having the faith and relationship that came with it. God expects wholehearted faith. And anything short of that leads to failure. Trying to obey God without wholly following him, it leads to failure. Now I can stop there and we'll all be like, that just seems like you just set the bar so incredibly high, Dennis. What the heck? Right? You're telling me wholehearted obedience. Anything less than wholehearted obedience leads to failure. Well, what am I supposed to do about that? Because let's be honest here. How many of us can go, I wholly follow God 24/7. Every single moment of my day, I wholly follow and obey him. And you're telling me that if I slip up just once, it just crumbles down? That's a lot of pressure, Dennis. And I'll be honest, I feel the same way. God, wholly follow. That's a standard so high. What am I supposed to do with that? But I look and then when we look at this, we see that Joshua messed up before. David later on, King David messed up. Abraham has messed up. The apostles have messed up. Paul has messed up. time and time again, we see all these things, but you're going, what's the difference? What's the difference between what Joshua did, what Abraham did, what King David did, and the people of Judah? What is the difference? And every time I look at this tug between wholly following God, like true faith, and having to wholly follow God, and my desires to rebel against him, this tension, I go, I know I'm not the only one feeling this tension, okay? I know I'm not the only one here where there's part of me that goes, I want to follow Jesus, and the other part is like, I just want to do my own thing. And when I'm at this tension, I go back to Mark chapter 9. One of the first passages I've ever preached on, and it just spoke so deep in my heart. It's about this boy. It's actually about this man. This man had a son. And his son was demon-possessed. And he sees Jesus. He comes to Jesus. And the disciples of Jesus could not heal this man's son. So this man goes to Jesus and he says this. He goes, if you can heal my son, please do. And Jesus says, if I can, it's like, if you have the faith. And this is how the man responds. The man says, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus answers him. He heals his son. And every time I look at that passage, I go, that's amazing. Because the guy says, I believe, but help the unbelief that's still in my heart. So one of the pastors I've been listening to, for my personal edification, when he talks about this passage, he describes it like this. God honors the fight. God honors the fight. And so for us this morning, we go, it's hard for us to wholly follow him. It's easier for, like if you want to say, are you Caleb? Are you Othniel? Or are you the people of Judah? I would probably say, I'm like the people of Judah. Right? Like I try to do it, but I'm not very good at it, and I really don't have my whole, I feel like I'm a failure. But in this passage, and it speaks through Scripture, God says God honors the fight. It's not if you have it perfect, is where does your heart and motivation lie? And for us this morning, maybe it's going, I have courageous faith. Help my cowardly faith. I have courageous faith, but help the cowardness inside of me, Lord. I believe, help my unbelief. God honors the fight. I want us to stop and examine ourselves this morning, where we are. Where do our motivations lie? Do we have this struggle, or are we saying, forget it, screw you, God? All right? I'll just do what you want me to do, but you know what? When it fails, it's all your fault. Forget it. I don't want any of that. Or are we actually going, I'm trying to believe, Lord, please, please fill what I can't. God honors the fight. Is the step towards obedience is what he honors. Is going one step at a time. I'm going to just wrap it up like this. This is what I want to see for my life and for our church's life. As we're talking about what does it look like to have wholehearted faith and active obedience. What does it mean to have courageous faith as God's people for God's promises according to, or for God's purposes according to God's promise? I want to see you and me actively participate with God in invading the dark places in our hearts and lives. I want us to be like Caleb, going, I will take the lands of my heart with you, God. To have the courageous faith to say, it is yours, not mine. Because that's where the first battle lies, within us. And the possessing the land is not something outward, but inside. And what's in our hearts. The dark places that we go, this is mine, God, and I'm not giving it to you. And God says, I want you to invade that space. And I want you to do it with me. That we participate with God in invading those dark places. We don't go and do it ourselves and report back to him. That he's leading the way and we follow him. And I want to see us a people that will be willing to invade the dark places in our hearts and lives. And for us as a church, I want to see a people who actively participate with God invading the dark places in our community. In Hayward or Fremont, San Leandro or Union City, Pleasanton or Milpitas, Sunnyvale or Piedmont, San Ramon or Dublin. This Bay Area has many dark places. And God has called us to participate with Him, to invade those dark places with His love, with His good news, with His hope, with His joy, with His peace. That God has called us to participate with Him. Will we do that? I'll just finish with this. This past week and a half, I had to serve in jury duty in Hayward. And long story short, it was a child abuse case that broke my heart because it was about a girl no older than the girls in Footprints. They lived in the community. And she told a little bit about her life story, just what's going on. It reminded me of some of the stories that I've heard in the past about some of our kids, our family. But the thing is, when I go and sit down and talk to some of these kids, they talk about, this is me back when. I used to be like that, but I'm not like that anymore. And of course, it's easy for me to look at some of these kids and go, man, why don't you have it together? But when you stop and go, this is how far they've came, it's mind-boggling. It gave me a lot of hope that and no matter how dark the situation is, God can and will change it, and He has. But as I sit there in the jury stand, listening to this story, I go, I wish I'd done more. Because there's more dark places in Hayward. I wish us as a church had more courage in God's promises. Because the work's not done. For every kid that has come in with a story about brokenness where God's healed, I know that there's stories that are still yet to be redeemed. God honors the fight. God honors the fight, so let's be encouraged that our mustard seed of faith is enough. Let's continue to fight our doubts about His power, about His plans, about His goodness. It's time for us to rise up and leave a legacy of faith in our families, in our church, and in our community. Because that's what God has called us to. Let us stand up and have courageous faith. Not in ourselves, not in what we can do, but what God has already done. Let us actively participate with Him in invading the dark places until He comes again. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, you give us two examples this morning, an encouraging one and a very sad reality. And may we look at the faith of Caleb and the faith of Othniel and say, Lord, if you are their God and what you have done for them, you're my God and you can do the same for me. To invade the dark places in my life, in my heart, and in our community. Let us stand up and be courageous, not in ourselves, not in our beliefs, not in what we can do, but in you. Let us have courageous faith in you to claim back what is yours. Whether it's sin or brokenness in this family or life. You're King, so rule, King Jesus.